which it turns out it's more correct to say the origins of Christianities, because I would say historically, right from the death of Jesus, Christianity split into multiple types.
Why knowledge matters. Dr. Joshua Schachterle, welcome on the show. It's such a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
And this is very interesting. And I think I looked a little bit to your social media, and you're really someone who has something to contribute when it comes to early Christianity. Now, first question, what is meant with early Christianity?
Right. So I'd say there are two answers to that question. The first answer is many scholars consider early Christianity about what we call Christian origins. In other words, what are the social, political, religious ideas that produced Christianity? And then the other is a broader definition, which says that early Christianity includes the 1st through the 7th centuries CE or AD, and everything that developed up until the beginning of the Middle Ages, which depending on your definition, is about the late 7th century. So, I mean, in my studies, I started out studying the New Testament and its, the times and conditions when that was written, its context, including the Gospels and the letters of Paul, the book of Revelation. I mean, all kinds of those things. And I love that. But it turns out that my interests and most of my historical focus have been on what's called the late antique period, which is a sort of a subset of early Christianity. And it goes from about 250 AD to roughly 700. And within that time frame, I focus mostly on the history of early Christian monastics, so monks and nuns, who lived in Egypt, Syria, and Palestine. So early Christianity has a couple of those different definitions, but for me, it's the broader definition all the way up to the Middle Ages. What were the developments intellectually, socially, culturally, politically that developed into what we now think of as Christianity?
What made you personally interested to study early Christianity?
Well, first of all, I was raised in a very strict Christian home, evangelical Christian home. And when I was a teenager, I actually rejected Christianity, mostly just for the reason that I found that I couldn't believe the things that I was supposed to believe in order to call myself a Christian, at least in the tradition that I grew up in. But in thinking about that, so this is in my late teens, early 20s, in thinking about what I was rejecting, I found it interesting to read about the origins of Christianity, which it turns out it's more correct to say the origins of Christianities, because I would say historically, right from the death of Jesus, Christianity split into multiple types. There was never just one whole Christianity. So when people ask about what did Christians do, I have to usually ask, which Christians? And unsurprisingly, most people don't even know about that stuff, because that's what we learn about in church or even in school about Christianity is normally about the group that won. I mean, there were these multiple competing Christianities for centuries. And you could even say there are today, and to some extent, right? I mean, there are different denominations. There are Catholic and Protestant. There are Orthodox. There are Mormon. I mean, there are all different forms of Christianity. And it's been like that from the very beginning of its history. So I got interested in that because I had grown up believing that the type of Christianity that I grew up with was the only one. And I was fascinated to learn that there are so many. And in graduate school, frankly, I met lots of different kinds of Christians. And I was shocked. I wasn't that young, but I was a little naive about Christianity. I kind of still figured everybody believed and practiced what I had grown up believing and practicing. And the range of practice, belief, ideas was so enormous among different Christians that it became hard to define what a Christian is, either in the ancient world or the modern world. So in the middle of all that, I discovered originally I discovered a book from the ancient world, a compilation of sayings and stories about and by monks and nuns called The Sayings of the Desert Fathers. And it was from about the 4th century. And it turns out that monks and nuns, really, the history of monks and nuns really began in the 4th century in Egypt, and also a little bit in Palestine and Syria. But there was a huge wave of it in Egypt. And it started out mostly with people going off and just living solitary lives. It wasn't monasteries originally. It was just solitaries living in caves or building stone huts and living alone and praying and practicing what is called asceticism. Are you familiar with that word?
Yeah,
Yeah,
I have heard it. Yeah.
Yeah, so asceticism in general means like self-denial for spiritual reasons. And that's something that you'll find in every religion. I mean, I've studied at least a little bit of most of the world religions. You certainly find it in Hinduism as a way to sort of improve your spiritual condition. You find it in Islam. I think it's done in Islam for many reasons, but it's certainly done. One of the reasons is certainly that they want you to have empathy for the poor, for people that don't have enough to eat. And because giving alms to the poor is very important in Islam. It's one of the 5 pillars. In Christianity, and at least among these monastics, it was mostly a sort of self-emptying. In other words, getting rid of this willful self that is selfish and wants for itself and wants its own survival and cares about its own. And with the idea that in that vacuum created by emptying the self, God and God's will would come in and would control you and sort of live your destiny for you. And that was the proper way to live. So that fascinated me. I mean, asceticism is a fascinating topic in general. But also in reading about, I guess in general, reading about in that book, as I mentioned, The Sayings of the Desert Fathers, it was so fascinating to me that people in the ancient world lived in such different ways from what we generally know as the mainstream of the ancient world. I mean, these monks were living very austere, extreme lives, and had ideals that you don't often find in ancient Christian writings. I'll give you an example. They had the idea that when Jesus in one of the Gospels says, "Judge not, lest you be judged," that you have to take that 100% seriously. You don't judge anyone for anything. Frankly, I don't even know if that would be possible for me. But there are wonderful stories in the Sayings of the Desert Fathers where, for example, a monk who is a master and is really accomplished and an elder monk is approached by someone who says, "Hey, you have to help us because this monk over here sinned and we have to kick him out and you have to be there." And he picks up a basket, puts a hole in the basket and fills it with sand and puts it on his back and walks. So the sand is leaking out. And people say, "What are you doing?" And he says, I'm here to look at somebody else's sins and my own are running out behind me and I can't even see them." So, I mean, a lot of great stories like that. Or another one where it's a similar situation where someone has sinned and they want to kick him out of the community. And the elder monk shows up, and when they say to the sinner monk, "Get out," this elder monk gets out and leaves with him. And they say, "Where are you going?" And he says, "I'm a sinner too." So that, to me, you don't see a lot of that in, for example, the New Testament. Jesus says, "Don't judge," but people judge. And so that was fascinating to me. And I was wondering how they connected their ideas of asceticism, of self-denial, to morality. And they seemed to think that over time, asceticism transformed not just the body, but the soul into a better person, a kinder person, a person that is more like Christ. And I just thought that was absolutely fascinating. And that's also what led me to the book that I wrote that is coming out in September. in reading about these monks, the sayings of the Desert Fathers was only the beginning. There's a huge amount of literature from that time, some of it about monks, some of it by monks, and much of it both. So I discovered a monk named John Cassian. And John Cassian, the name of my book is John Cassian and the Creation of Monastic Subjectivity. And John Cassian was a monk. He was actually born into a Latin-speaking family in the Roman Empire in what is now Romania. And he ended up going to Bethlehem in Palestine to become a monk. And after a while of being there in a monastery, sort of what we think of as monks, huge number of monks and living together. And after a while of being there, someone came who was from Egypt and told all these stories about the monks of Egypt. And the monks of Egypt had been written about already by that time and were kind of seen as heroes. Stories of their lives, especially one called The Life of Antony, who was often called the father of monasticism, were bestsellers in the ancient world. People read them an incredible amount. And so after hearing and reading those stories, he and another young monk decided they had to travel to Egypt and see these monks and meet them for themselves. So they did, and they ended up becoming monks in Egypt for about 15 years. And then a lot of things happened, a lot of difficult things happened, and Cassian had to leave Egypt. He went to Constantinople, which is modern Istanbul, for a short time, and then to Rome. And then finally, at the end of his life, ended up in what is now France, in Marseille, was then called the province of Gaul. And he was asked by the people there, by the monks there, specifically the bishop, if he could write manuals for the monks in Gaul. And the reason was everybody had this idea that only the Egyptian monks really know how to be monks, that in Gaul, they just weren't doing it right. And so he had to figure out how to do it right. So I started reading his manuals as a way to understand him and, monastic practice in general. But what I found was a surprising quote. And here's what it is. It's very short. He's talking about vainglory. I don't know if you've heard that word before. Vainglory, I would probably, in regular parlance, we'd probably just call it pride. The idea of thinking that I'm great and arrogance. And he says, in order to avoid that, monks ought by all means to flee from women and bishops. Now, if he just said monks should flee from women, that would be understandable, because in the ancient world, women were seen often as temptresses. It wasn't seen as, oh, the man's sexual appetite is the problem. It was seen as women tempt us, and that's not our fault. So the idea of monks who were supposed to be celibate, avoiding women, that makes perfect sense. But avoiding bishops was fascinating to me. And Cassian himself says, this is not my phrase. This is a phrase that everybody says in Egypt, all the monks. So I had to start asking myself, why would you have to avoid bishops? Now, avoiding women, okay, you're avoiding desire, you're avoiding sexuality. But bishops, well, and what does that have to do? What does avoiding bishops have to do with avoiding vainglory or pride? Well, it turns out that monks thought that the ambition to become somebody important in the church, a priest, a bishop, a deacon, would cause you to have vainglory. And the most important virtue for monks was humility. You had to be humble, or you would not, in their words, enter the kingdom of heaven. And so they thought that importance was dangerous for a monk, and that it would kind of wreck the monk's vocation. And so at the time, that ended up being my research question, which drove the whole thing. And what the answer I came to after a lot of research was that John Cassian wanted monks and nuns, the monastic part of the church, to be its own separate part of the church. In other words, to be its own authority, so that bishops would not have authority over them, priests would not have authority over them, deacons would not have authority over them, because those people couldn't really understand the way of life of monastics. Now, this didn't happen. The church did end up co-opting them. And it's interesting, even at the time, and this happens a lot in the sayings of the Desert Fathers, bishops would send like henchmen out to the desert to find the most popular monks, because the monks had become in many ways more popular with lay people than bishops. So people would skip the bishop in their village church and risk their lives to go out into the desert to find these monks, because they thought they were the ones with wisdom and they were the ones who were holy and could intercede with God for them. So this made the church uncomfortable, because monks at that point were not officially part of the church, and they weren't defined. So they weren't lay people, they weren't bishops or clergy. So what were they? And the church didn't have control over them. So what I was saying was they used to send groups of henchmen out into the desert to kidnap these monks and force them to be bishops, so that being a bishop would be more popular. Some of the monks avoided that by extreme measures. There's a story in one writing that says that the monk cut off his ear and said, "There, you can't take me in, because I'm not allowed to be a priest if I'm not whole in my body." And when the bishop says, "I don't care about that, take him anyway," he says, if you try to take me again, I'll cut my tongue out. I mean, that's an extreme reaction to wanting to be a bishop. And so I think it goes back to the idea of vainglory, of we want to be ascetics. We want to live in the desert. We want to do what we know works for our spiritual well-being. And we don't want to be in charge of a congregation or all those other responsibilities. This is what we want. And so, again, my argument is that Cassian was advocating for that in his writings, subtly, because if you said things too explicitly like that in those days, you would get in a lot of trouble, to the point of maybe being burned at the stake or something. But he is subtly, I argued over and over, saying, yeah, monastics, we know what other monastics should be doing. Bishops, clergy, they don't know that.
That's really fascinating, because it almost seems like we are always in cycles. And
yes,
because you have the same today, right? People leaving the church, the official church, in that I mean the Catholic Church, they don't
yes,
want to have to do it. They go to India, they want to, basically become their own master, or want to find somehow a master.
right.
So it's very interesting how this actually unfolds. This is really fascinating. On your Twitter account, you explicitly mention that you are not a Christian. Why is that? Is this a scholarly stand, or what is it?
So it's partly a scholarly stand, but I'll tell you the main reason is simply that people, when they saw that I was a scholar of early Christianity, they would often come to me and say things like, "Hey, I need spiritual advice. I'm a Christian and I need to know, how should I live? And what does this Bible passage mean?" And not only am I not qualified to do that, I'm not interested in that. I'm not a Christian and I didn't want to. So it was really just a way to say, please don't ask me that type of question. If you want to ask me some scholarly questions about, the history of the Bible, I call myself an intellectual historian, which means that I love the history of ideas. How did certain ideas develop? Christianity was not the same in the beginning as it was in the Middle Ages, and it wasn't the same in the Middle Ages as it is now. And I love to see the development of those ideas. So in other words, when I talk to people about my research, I always start by saying, look, I come at Christianity from a perspective of history, not faith. I'm not trying to tell you what to believe or not to believe. I don't have anything against Christianity in the sense of like, there are, for example, atheists that are out there crusading to stamp out Christianity. I'm not that at all. I find it a fascinating way to study history and ideas. And so, yeah, I'm not a pastor. I guess mostly what interests me is looking at evidence for early Christianity, and that in my case is mostly writings. I'm not an archaeology student, although sometimes archaeological finds help to inform my research as well. But I look at ancient writings and I interpret the evidence historically to understand where the ideas of Christianity came from, how they developed, and maybe even in some cases how we got to where we are now. And so here's an example of that. In I was just rereading an old scholarly book about Augustine, who I'm sure you've heard of. Mm. Augustine was a bishop in the 5th century, but he was also a very important theologian, and a lot of his ideas are very influential to this day in Christianity. So a lot of people may not know this, but the whole story of Adam and Eve in the garden and their sin and them being kicked out of the garden, Augustine is the one who came up with the idea that that should be called original sin. I don't actually know if he used those exact words. He may not have. But the idea that their sin, Adam and Eve's sin, automatically passed on to all their descendants, which is all of us, and so that we are all born sinners. What's interesting about that, now that is certainly how I grew up believing in the church that I went to. But what's interesting is that if you look at interpretations by other Christians before Augustine, nobody thought that. Nobody thought, for example, that one person's sin automatically inflicted sin upon every other member of the human race forever. That was an innovation of Augustine's, his own interpretation, that happened to, because he was influential in the church, happened to spread and eventually became understood as the right way to think. Now, that doesn't mean that every Christian today thinks that. They definitely don't. But a lot of them do. That's definitely, I think, that's considered a pillar of Christianity to this day in most cases, certainly in the Catholic Church.
I think what is also, interesting when you look a little bit experientially, when we look at our lives and, our desires and all this stuff, I think it's not far-fetched actually to say that if you set your moral standard, extremely high in this sense, I think, when it comes to desire, you're lost or whatever. And, in the Bible, for example, as it says, just thinking, having desire of someone else is basically already committing adultery.
Right.
One aspect also is so interesting because now we have the science too. And to some extent, we could argue, I think, for example, intergenerational trauma, that's something we know, especially if Holocaust survivor, is a fact. And in this sense too, it actually proves to some extent what those teaching in the Bible or other religious texts really taught us up to today.
I think to some extent, but I also think that, for example, to say that desiring another person sexually is the same morally as committing adultery, I feel like that ignores the reality of our minds. If I tell you, don't think of a pink elephant, what's the first thing you think of? Our minds are not entirely under our control. And the fact that a desire arises, to me, is very different from acting on that desire. So I would draw a big moral distinction personally between, okay, I had this thought. That thought is not a good one to act on. I'm going to reject acting on it. So the ancient world did not have psychology as we have it. They didn't have science in the way we have it. And so I think there are reasons to reinterpret a lot of those ancient teachings, given what we know now.
Yeah, certainly. What has early Christianity taught us up to date?
So again, as a non-Christian, in my case, it's going to be more historical, this answer, than moral. But I still think it's fascinating. One thing that a lot of people, Christians and non-Christians in the modern world, don't know is that when Christianity first started to spread in the Roman Empire, it started in this little tiny faction in Palestine, right? But over time, over centuries, it started to spread. And as it started to spread, most Romans thought of it as in the way we think of a cult. It was a tiny group with weird beliefs. I mean, they believed that a man who had been executed by the state, so it was like us worshiping someone who had been in the electric chair for murder or for insurrection or something. So that in itself was bizarre to them. And that he came back from the dead, that was a very bizarre belief. And they actually, they thought it was such a cult and that it was possibly dangerous to the Roman state, partly because Christians would not sacrifice to Roman gods. Now, I used to have a misunderstanding of that. I used to think that that was because they didn't want Christians to worship their own God. That wasn't the case. The case was it was a duty of every Roman citizen to sacrifice in some way to some Roman god. And there were a huge number of Roman gods. They weren't limited, really, in order for good things to happen in Rome. In other words, for the crops to come in, for Rome to win in war. So a Christian, by saying, I won't sacrifice to those gods, was like treason. It was like saying, I won't try to help Rome. And in other words, I'm hurting Rome. There's an ancient Christian writer who lived in North Africa, which was controlled by the Roman Empire, who writes that all the non-Christians blame the Christians anytime something goes wrong. If there's an earthquake, it's the Christians' fault because they didn't sacrifice. If there's moral depravity, it's the Christians' fault. And speaking of moral depravity, because Romans thought it was a cult, they spread a lot of very vicious rumors about Christianity, trying to get it outlawed. Rumors that would shock us now. For example, that they regularly had orgies, which is funny to think about. And also that they regularly ate human flesh, especially babies. So they had these crazy extreme rumors about them. And we know from history that any new sort of religious movement that came up in those times, people in the bigger pagan movement at the time would make up rumors like that to discredit them. So anyway, your question is, what has early Christianity taught us? I think one of the things that's really important for me as a historian is that there are always in everything human, every idea, every movement, there are always prior causes and conditions. In other words, if you are a Christian, you believe that God created the universe out of nothing. And I think that's fine. But I think we can all agree that humans cannot create out of nothing. If you see an idea and you think, that's a bizarre, strange idea, where did that come from? You can bet that it had precedence, that it wasn't just invented out of whole cloth by that person. And so in the case of Christianity, the socio-cultural context of its origins included many things, but the easiest to see are first century Judaism and the rule of Rome over the Jewish homeland. And so that basically means two things. Early Christianity, if you read the Gospels and the words of Jesus, you will see, and you can find contemporary Jewish writers around the same time as him saying a lot of the same things. The Golden Rule, for example, was said by many Jewish thinkers. A lot of what Jesus said about being kind, about forgiving, about all of those sorts of things, about compassion and kindness, all had Jewish precedents. So it was not something that came out of nothing and just exploded into, wow, these are completely new ideas. His Jewish hearers would have recognized most of these ideas. The other thing, when it comes to Rome, is Christianity, Rome was an extremely dominant power at the time of Christianity in the first century. And yet it seems that obviously we know there were Jewish movements against them to try to liberate their homeland. But there were also sort of subtle Christian movements. They weren't military. They weren't attacking or trying to do a coup d'etat or something. But in the way they wrote about God and Jesus, you could see that they were against the empire. One of the earliest Christian affirmations of faith, for example, was Jesus is Lord. Now, to modern Christians, that just sounds simple. It's like, yeah, well, Jesus is Lord, great. But what that meant at the time, the word Lord, or kurios in Greek, was a political term. So it was most often used for the highest people in office, especially the emperor. So these people, when there are arguments and plaques and monuments saying Caesar is Lord, and then these people are writing Jesus is Lord, that's directly in opposition to the Roman Empire, which is extremely dangerous thing to do. So it turns out that they were a political faction as well, in the sense that they thought the world should not be ruled by Rome, because Rome is corrupt. Rome are, corrupt human beings. The world should be ruled by God. And that is what Jesus meant when he talks about the kingdom of God or the kingdom of heaven. He didn't mean up in space somewhere. He meant it, those of us acting well, acting in the right ways, bring that kingdom of God to earth, make the earth a kingdom of God. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. How much of early Christianity is left today in the first century, and how much does it influence still, if at all, our lives?
Yeah. So
in the West.
So that's a great question and a very difficult one to answer, and I'll explain why, and then I'll tell you what I think. In the ancient world, about 10% of people at most could read and write. So, and of course, that 10% were the wealthiest 10%. They were the only ones who could be educated. And most of them, by the way, were men. Women could be educated if they were in the higher echelons of society, but even then it wasn't as common as it was for the men. And so because you have these tiny fractions of people that are writing at the time, part of the problem with studying ancient writings of any kind, including Christianity, is that they give us only the perspective of those wealthy elite people. The vast majority, the other 90% who are just barely surviving and are extremely poor in most cases, we have no idea what their perspective was, because they couldn't leave us any writings. We have to guess a lot. And so, for example, I mentioned Augustine earlier. Augustine was extremely influential, and he was the bishop of a church. So he had congregations that he spoke to, and I'm sure they were influenced by him. But we have no way of knowing to what extent. Like, did they all believe in original sin the way he outlined it? Or did a lot of them disagree and just sort of go, I don't believe that. We don't know. And we also, in the same way, we don't know a lot of what kinds of beliefs a lot of early Christians had. We don't know all the practices they had. I will say that if you look at, I don't know if you've heard of, I don't know what your background is religiously, but if you've heard of the Nicene Creed.
No.
Okay, well, that's okay. That's okay. That's why I asked. When an emperor called Constantine in the 4th century, he was the first Roman emperor to convert to Christianity. So this is like, 400 years after, well, a little over 300 years after the death of Jesus. The emperor converts to Christianity. Now, that was important for a lot of reasons, but one of them is that he decided, he looked out on the landscape of Christian belief and practice and realized that there were so many competing Christianities, and politically, it was very expedient for him to form them all into one belief and say, this is Christian, because that was much easier to control and much easier to decide who was right and who was wrong. But that was always going to be a fight. So what he did was he convened a council in the city of Nicaea, which was in Turkey, modern Turkey. And he had, we still don't know if this is true, but the stories written about it say that there were 318 bishops there, and from all over the Roman Empire. And they got in there and they debated what should be believed. And I won't go into a lot of details, but what they ended up hammering out are basic, what I would call propositional beliefs that you have to say yes to in order to claim Christianity as your religion. And a lot of those, I would say, and again, this is 300 years after the beginning of Christianity. These beliefs had not been there originally. But a lot of those beliefs continue as Christian beliefs. So, for example, there's only one God. God created the universe. Jesus was God's son. I'm going to forget a lot of the things now. God will come to judge the living and the dead at the end of the world. Things like that you have to assent to and agree to if you are to be a Christian in most traditions, certainly in the one I grew up in, although there are many that don't agree with those. So I would say that is a survival for the most part. I would also say, though, that you have to remember that and this happens in all religions. This is one thing I find fascinating about religions, is when a religion spreads from its country of origin to another country, it changes. And it usually changes because of the culture of the people in the destination, in the new place. So for example, when Buddhism was founded in Nepal and India, when it spread to China, it became very different. And that was because it took on characteristics of Chinese culture and religion. And that tends to happen everywhere. And it happened certainly in Christianity. So after the end of the Roman Empire, when Christianity spread to beyond Europe to, Christianity is now everywhere. When it spread to China, it became different from the way it was in Palestine, which was different from the way it became in Turkey, which is different from the way it became in France. And so it's very hard to know, looking at those different writings, even in the ancient world, which of those practices and beliefs that they outline are universal to all Christians at the time, if any, or which are just local to that group because that was the way it developed locally there. Here's an example. The word bishop comes from a Greek word, episkopos, which in the Roman Empire generally meant like an overseer, a boss, someone who supervises or guards. And so in Rome, this was a kind of government office. So let's say you're in the office of finance. If you are the boss of that office, you are the episkopos, the bishop. Well, obviously Christianity took on that word, but that was a Roman word and a Roman idea. That didn't come from Jesus or Paul or any of those people. It wasn't something that was original to it. It was picked up later because Christianity became important in Rome. So it always took on those local features. So it's hard to know. It's easier to know in some cases what the beliefs were, although again, some of those beliefs might only apply to the wealthy elite who are writing about them. It's harder to know, for example, practices. We know, for example, that early Christians often did a lot of prostrations. They would, get down on the ground and bow, much the way Muslims do to this day. And that was an important aspect of Christian practice and prayer because you were humbling yourself and it was teaching your body and your mind to be humble. That still exists in some traditions. Egyptian Christians, who are called Coptic Christians, they still do that. I think actually Orthodox Christians across the board in Greek and Greece and Russia and places like that still do that. Whereas it would be very hard to find an American Christian or a Canadian Christian doing that, right? So yeah, and then so that's another factor. And then finally, Christian teachings have had to be reinterpreted as time has gone on, as historical events have changed, as cultures have changed, as new languages have developed. So things that applied, for example, in the 1st century AD, you try to take those and apply them to 21st century United States, for example, it's often very difficult and you have to change around how you interpret them. Here's one example. The book of Revelation, which is the last book of the New Testament, it was written at the end of the 1st century, maybe the beginning of the 2nd. And so that it was still the Roman Empire. And what it's really about, a lot of people don't know this, what it's really about is God coming down and ending the reign of the Roman Empire. So as I mentioned before, there was a lot of anti-Roman Empire sentiment in early Christianity. And that's what this book is about. It is about Jesus coming down with a sword and destroying Rome. But in the 1800s, groups of Christians in England and the United States came to believe that it was about the end of the world, not the end of Rome. And so that was a total reinterpretation on their part. It wouldn't have made sense on their part to make universal teachings about the end of Rome because Rome was already gone. Rome as an empire was no longer an influence, didn't matter anymore. So they took the modern world and said, no, it must not be about that. It must be about the end of the planet and how we can avoid being the ones who go down for eternal punishment in hell and be the ones who go up with Jesus to heaven. That's a complete reinterpretation, which as a historian, I have to refute because the facts in the book don't fit it. But I can't define the way people believe or interpret things like that. All I can do is say, this is the evidence that I see, and this is what I know about that time and that context. So Christians in general have to interpret those things for themselves. And as history goes on, they will have to continue to reinterpret those things to fit their new context.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. I think it's also really important. Again, you are a historian in this sense of early Christianity, and it's obviously different because you look at the facts and a claim like resurrection, it just doesn't really fit, and yet it can be very interesting, and it differs from other faiths. When we look at Christianity, what happens, for example, it's really radical, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there's nothing really in between. You can either believe that he was risen, or he was not, but you can't really say, well, he was just an outstanding teacher, because if someone claimed to be God, really the Son of God, but which really means God, then you have to say, well, then he wasn't a good teacher. He was actually insane. So I think there's so many interesting facets that there is, and also how it spread, right? So it was just really kind of this bottom up, and Constantine ultimately decided, for whatever reason, to actually then take it on, and because he was still in power at that time, and of
Yeah.
course there might have been some political turmoil, and it might have been a political move, but we don't know what
No,
really
we don't know.
happens. Yeah,
That's true.
really fascinating, Dr. Schachterle. Now, last question, and here really I ask you to contemplate like early Christianity and the today's context we live in, with a lot of political, social, and really environmental disruption. What makes you hopeful for the future?
Well, first, I'll say two things. First of all, I think it's always possible. The turmoil happens again and again throughout history. When you go back as far as I go back in my studies, a couple of thousand years or more, you see constant turmoil. We're living through a pandemic. There were many pandemics in the ancient world, and they didn't have half the knowledge we had. And yet some people survived and they moved on. There have been wars and terrible treatment of people throughout history. And yet people generally tend to survive and they move on. Now, again, this is not to say that those things aren't terrible or that we should just brush them off and, it's no big deal. Absolutely not. But it's always hopeful to me to know that if people in the ancient world could survive things like pandemics, surely we can survive well this too, and we can learn from them. So that's the biggest thing I take from history. The other thing I take is a little more personal. I absolutely love the study of early Christianity, despite the fact that I'm not religious myself. And despite the fact, what I think is fascinating is despite the fact that all of it happened centuries ago, scholars are still finding new ways to understand and interpret the writings that we have. While archaeologists are still finding new material evidence for those things. So all of this gives us new and expanded ways to see Christian history. And I find that exciting and hope to participate for years to come. And I'll give you a couple of examples of that. One of my favorite scholars right now is a woman named Annette Yoshiko Reed, who was at NYU. And she studies Jewish studies. She put out a book recently in which she decided to study early Christianity as a facet of Jewish history or the history of Judaism, rather than the way it usually goes, which is study Judaism as a stepping stone to Christianity. And that book changed everything for me. It was like, oh my God, I hadn't thought of Christianity as, wow, what did that do to Judaism? How did it influence Judaism? What did Judaism do post-Christianity? There's a whole huge, wide array of studies that can be done from that perspective. And I find that wonderful. And the other one is, this one came out, 40 years ago, but I'm still going to say it because it was very new and innovative at the time. There was a scholar at Princeton in the early 80s named Peter Brown, and he wrote a book called The Cult of the Saints. So he was writing about how in early Roman Christianity, they started for the first time praying to saints. And the understood idea by scholars at that time was that, oh, this was just something that the poor brought in as a holdover from their previous pagan religions. In other words, they took the gods and made them saints and then prayed to them. And that seems like a reasonable thing to assume. But Peter Brown found a lot of evidence that instead what was happening, it wasn't coming from the lower classes up, it was coming from the upper classes down, because there was a system that was called the patron-client system in early Rome. And what this means is wealthy people would use their money and influence for their clients who were, for example, writing things for them or doing jobs for them or getting them into the Senate or things like that. And so what Peter Brown ends up finding is that the same language used for that patron-client system is used for the saints. So the saints they actually became the new patrons. And people thought of them as their patrons. They prayed, please use your influence on God, intercede for me to get my daughter a husband, or things like that. So that made perfect sense, but it kind of blew the field open at the time, because it was totally against the way it had been assumed to be. So that always gives me hope, because I think a lot of times people, when I mention what I study, people will say, well, what's there to study? All the data is out there. It's been there for thousands of years. Nobody's making any new data. And I say, yeah, but there's new ways to look at it. And there's always more information on that. And that to me is fascinating, and that keeps me going.
Dr. Joshua Schachterle, thank you so much for being on the show. It has been such a pleasure, and continue your important work. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Yannick.
That's why knowledge matters.